1945, the bizarre shot that stopped a German advance in France. Before we dive into this incredible story, please subscribe and hit that like button. These historical deep dives require months of research through military archives, veteran testimonies, and declassified documents. Your support helps us continue bringing you these forgotten stories from World War II. Now, let's explore one of the most unusual moments of the war's final months. Chapter 1. The Desperate Days of January 1945. January 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final brutal phase. Germany was collapsing, squeezed between the Soviet advance from the east and the Allied push from the west. But collapse doesn't mean surrender, and the Wehrmacht, though depleted, exhausted, and facing inevitable defeat, could still fight with the desperation of cornered animals. In the Alsace region of eastern France near the German border, this desperation manifested in a series of counterattacks that caught Allied forces off guard. Operation Nordwind, the last major German offensive on the Western Front, had begun on New Year's Eve, and while it lacked the scale and shock of the Battle of the Bulge that had preceded it, it was nonetheless causing significant problems for American and French forces in the region. The French First Army, under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, held a sector of the front that included the village of Riedveer, a small farming community that had changed hands multiple times during the war. By mid-January, the village was in French hands, but barely. German forces were probing the French positions, looking for weaknesses, preparing for a push that might break through and create a gap in the Allied lines. Captain Henri Moreau commanded a company of the 3rd Algerian Infantry Division, part of the French colonial forces that had fought their way from North Africa through Italy and into France. His men were veterans, hardened by years of combat, but they were also exhausted. Months of continuous fighting had worn them down and replacements were scarce. The 120 men of his company held a defensive line that should have required twice that number. "We were spread too thin," Moreau later recalled in his memoir published in 1968. "Every man covered a front that was twice what doctrine recommended. We had limited ammunition, inadequate winter clothing, and the knowledge that if the Germans broke through our section, the entire French position in the region could collapse." On the morning of January 20th, 1945, intelligence reports indicated German forces were massing for an attack. Aerial reconnaissance had spotted movement, armor, infantry, supply vehicles, all pointing toward Moreau's sector. The attack would come today, maybe within hours. Moreau positioned his men as best he could. Machine gun nests covered the most likely approach routes. Mortars were pre-registered on suspected German assembly areas. The few anti-tank weapons available were carefully positioned where they might do the most good, and scouts were sent forward to provide early warning when the attack began. But there was one position that worried Moreau more than any other: a ruined farmhouse about 800 meters forward of the main French line. The building had been gutted by artillery fire weeks earlier, leaving only partial walls and the skeleton of what had once been a prosperous farm. It sat on a slight rise that overlooked the valley approaches to Riedveer, offering excellent observation of any German advance. That farmhouse was both an asset and a vulnerability, Moreau explained. "If we held it, we'd have advance warning and could direct fire on attacking forces. If the Germans took it, they'd have a perfect staging point for their assault, protected from our direct fire until they were ready to move." Moreau needed someone in that farmhouse, someone who could observe, report, and if necessary, delay the German advance for even a few precious minutes while the main line prepared. But sending men to such an exposed position was essentially a death sentence. When the Germans came, and they would come, that farmhouse would be the first position they'd overrun. He called for volunteers. To his surprise, though perhaps not, given the caliber of men who'd fought their way across Africa and Europe, several stepped forward immediately. Among them was Corporal Jacques Dubois. Chapter 2. The Unlikely Hero. Jacques Dubois was not what anyone would have envisioned as a military hero. At 34 years old, he was older than most of the soldiers in the company. Before the war, he'd been a postal clerk in Lyon, a quiet, methodical man who spent his days sorting letters and maintaining precise records. He wore glasses, had a slight build, and possessed none of the physical swagger that characterized many combat soldiers. But Dubois had one skill that made him extraordinary. He was possibly the finest marksman in the entire division. He'd learned to shoot as a teenager, hunting in the mountains near his home. His methodical personality translated perfectly to marksmanship, the patience to wait for the perfect shot, the discipline to control breathing and heartbeat, the mathematical precision to calculate distance, wind, and trajectory. When he'd been conscripted into the army in 1940, his shooting skills had been quickly recognized, and he'd been assigned as a designated marksman, not quite a sniper, but close. Through 5 years of war, Dubois had survived. He'd fought in Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, and now France. He'd seen friends die, had been wounded twice himself, minor wounds that left scars but not disability, and had accumulated the kind of combat experience that kept soldiers alive when luck ran out. When Moreau asked for volunteers for the farmhouse position, Dubois stepped forward without hesitation. "Sir, I'll go," he said quietly. "I can observe from there, and if they come, I can slow them down." Moreau studied him. "Jacques, you understand what I'm asking. That farmhouse will be the first thing they hit. You'll be alone, possibly surrounded with minimal support. Your chances of getting back are—" "I understand, sir. Why volunteer?" Dubois adjusted his glasses, a habitual gesture that somehow made him look even less like a combat soldier. "Because someone needs to be there, and because I'm probably the best person for the job. My shooting might buy the company a few minutes, that could matter." Moreau nodded slowly. "All right, take Private Fontaine with you as observer and runner. Extra ammunition, the radio, water and rations for 24 hours, though I hope you won't be there that long. Set up in the most defensible position you can find. Report German movements immediately. And Jacques, if it becomes impossible to hold, withdraw. Don't be a hero. Just fall back to our lines." Dubois smiled slightly. "Yes, sir, no heroics." That afternoon, Dubois and 19-year-old Private Marc Fontaine moved forward to the ruined farmhouse. They carried their rifles, ammunition, the radio, and a few personal items. The winter landscape was bleak, bare trees, frozen ground, the skeletal remains of what had once been productive farmland, now scarred by years of war. The farmhouse was even more ruined than it had appeared from a distance. The roof was completely gone. Most of the second floor had collapsed into the first. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes and shrapnel damage, but portions of the stone walls still stood, offering some cover, and the collapsed roof timbers could be arranged to create a hidden firing position. "Not the worst place I've been," Fontaine remarked, trying to sound optimistic despite the obvious vulnerability of their position. Dubois surveyed the ruins with his methodical eye, already calculating fields of fire, escape routes, best positions for observation. "We'll set up here," he said, pointing to a corner where two partial walls met. "Good view of the valley approaches. Some cover from direct fire. Close to that collapsed section if we need to withdraw quickly." They spent the next hour preparing their position, arranging rubble for additional protection, creating a concealed firing position, testing the radio to ensure they could communicate with the main line, setting out their ammunition. Dubois had 150 rounds for his rifle, more than usual, anticipating a prolonged engagement. As darkness fell, they settled in to wait. Fontaine took the first watch while Dubois tried to rest, knowing that when the Germans came, and they would come, he'd need every ounce of concentration and steadiness he possessed. The night passed slowly, punctuated by distant artillery fire and the occasional flare that briefly illuminated the frozen landscape. No movement on their front. The Germans were preparing, assembling forces, waiting for morning. At 05:30 hours, just before dawn on January 21st, Fontaine shook Dubois awake. "Movement, multiple vehicles, infantry, looks like company strength or more. They're forming up about 2 kilometers out." Dubois grabbed the radio. "Leopard base, this is Outpost 1. Enemy formation assembling grid coordinates." He rattled off the location. "Estimate company strength, possibly battalion. Armor present, preparing for assault." The radio crackled back. Captain Moreau's voice. "Outpost 1, understood. Hold as long as possible. Report when they begin their advance. Good luck." "Understood, sir." Dubois and Fontaine watched as the German force organized. Through binoculars, they could see infantry climbing onto armored vehicles, officers moving between units, the methodical preparation for an attack. The Germans were confident. They outnumbered the French defenders significantly, had armor support, and probably assumed the ruined farmhouse was unoccupied. They were about to learn otherwise. Chapter 3. The advance begins. At 06:15 hours, as gray dawnlight spread across the frozen landscape, the German advance began. It was textbook Wehrmacht doctrine, even in these desperate final months of the war. A line of infantry stretched across the valley floor, moving in loose formation, using whatever cover the terrain offered. Behind them, 3 armored vehicles, 2 Stug-3 assault guns and a Panzer IV tank, provided mobile firepower and intimidation. The force was smaller than what the Germans would have deployed earlier in the war, but still formidable against the thinly stretched French defenses. Leopard Base Outpost 1, Dubois transmitted calmly. Enemy advance beginning. Infantry line approximately 150 meters frontage, 3 armored vehicles in support, speed approximately 3 kilometers per hour, current range 1800 meters. Understood, Outpost 1. Engaging with artillery when they reach pre-registered zones. Dubois lowered the radio and picked up his rifle. It was a MAS 36, the standard French bolt-action rifle, not the most advanced weapon of the war, but reliable, accurate, and familiar. He'd carried this particular rifle for 2 years, knew its quirks and characteristics, could predict exactly where a bullet would go at any range up to 800 meters. The German advance continued. They were being cautious. No rushing, maintaining formation, watching for threats. At 1200 meters, they were beyond effective rifle range. At 1000 meters, still too far for accurate fire. At 800 meters, entering the range where Dubois might make a shot, but the French artillery would open fire first. And it did. Mortar rounds began falling among the advancing Germans. Not a massive barrage, the French didn't have enough ammunition for that, but accurate fire that disrupted the formation. Several soldiers went down. Others scattered for cover. The armored vehicles accelerated, trying to push through the beaten zone before more rounds arrived. But the German advance didn't stop. It couldn't. Their orders were to break through, and they had the numbers to absorb casualties and keep moving. 600 meters now. Dubois could see individual faces through his rifle's iron sights. Young men, most of them, probably conscripts, possibly old men and boys given the Wehrmacht's desperate need for manpower in these final months. They looked cold, scared, but determined. They kept coming. "We should start shooting," Fontaine said nervously, his own rifle ready. "Not yet," Dubois replied calmly. "We have limited ammunition. Each shot needs to count. Let them get closer." 500 meters. French machine guns from the main line opened fire, tracers arcing across the valley. More Germans went down, but the majority kept advancing, returning fire now, the distinctive crack of German Mauser rifles joining the cacophony of battle. 400 meters. The Germans had spotted the ruined farmhouse now. Officers were pointing at it, clearly discussing whether it was occupied, whether it posed a threat. A section of infantry began moving toward it, probably tasked with clearing the position before the main force passed. "Now," Dubois said quietly. He settled his rifle against his shoulder, controlled his breathing, acquired his target, a German officer who appeared to be directing the troops toward the farmhouse. The mathematics were automatic after years of practice. Range 380 meters, slight crosswind from the left, target moving slowly toward his position. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. The German officer dropped instantly. "Good shot," Fontaine breathed. But Dubois was already working the bolt, chambering another round, acquiring his next target. Another German, this one pointing at the farmhouse, having just witnessed his officer fall. Dubois fired. The man spun and collapsed. The German advance toward the farmhouse faltered. Soldiers scattered for cover, suddenly aware that the ruins were occupied, and that whoever was inside was a deadly shot. Over the next 5 minutes, Dubois fired 8 more times. 8 shots, 8 hits. Not all were fatal. He wasn't trying to kill, just to disrupt, to create uncertainty, to make the Germans cautious when they needed to be bold, and it was working. The German advance had stalled. Infantry that had been moving steadily forward was now hugging whatever cover they could find. The armored vehicles had slowed, uncertain whether to proceed past the farmhouse while it was still occupied. Officers were shouting orders, but the soldiers' natural sense of self-preservation was stronger than discipline in that moment. Then the Germans made their decision. They would neutralize the farmhouse before proceeding. One of the Stug-3 assault guns rotated its gun toward the ruins. Dubois saw it, recognized what was about to happen. "Down!" he shouted, pulling Fontaine behind the thickest section of remaining wall. The assault gun fired. The shell impacted the farmhouse with a thunderous explosion, blowing apart what remained of the western wall. Stone fragments flew like shrapnel. Dust filled the air, making it impossible to see. When the dust cleared slightly, Dubois assessed the damage. Their position was partially exposed now, offering less cover, but they were alive and the rifle was undamaged. "Leopard Base taking direct fire from armor," he transmitted. "Still operational. Outpost 1. Withdraw if position becomes untenable." "Understood." "Not yet." The assault gun fired again. Another section of wall exploded. Dubois and Fontaine pressed themselves against the ground as debris rained down around them. "Corporal, we need to go," Fontaine shouted over the ringing in their ears. "They're going to bring this whole place down." "One more," Dubois said, rising to a shooting position even as dust and smoke swirled around him. Chapter 4. The Impossible Shot. What happened next became the subject of debate, analysis, and legend for decades afterward. The military records are clear on the basic facts, but the interpretation, whether what occurred was incredible skill, impossible luck, or something that defied conventional explanation, remained controversial. Dubois brought his rifle up, his movements automatic despite the chaos around him. Through the swirling dust and smoke, he could barely see the German formation. The assault gun that had just fired at them was approximately 350 meters away, its commander visible in the open cupola directing the vehicle's crew. Standard doctrine said that rifle fire against armored vehicles was useless. Bullets couldn't penetrate armor. The best you could hope for was to suppress accompanying infantry or force the crew to button up and reduce visibility. But Dubois wasn't thinking about doctrine. He was thinking about geometry, trajectory, and a shot that was technically possible even if it was practically impossible. The assault gun's commander stood in the open cupola, his head and shoulders exposed. Behind him, visible through the open hatch, was the vehicle's interior. And in that interior, partially visible, was the gunner who'd been firing at the farmhouse. Dubois understood vehicle design. He knew that if a bullet could somehow enter through that open cupola, travel through the relatively confined interior space, it might strike something critical. Crew, ammunition, controls. The chance was minuscule. The shot was essentially impossible. But impossible was just a calculation of probability. And right now, probability favored taking any shot that might disrupt the German advance. He aimed not at the commander, too obvious. And even if he hit, another crew member would simply take over. He aimed at the tiny opening behind the commander, the space where a bullet might enter the vehicle's interior. Range, 350 meters. Target, an opening perhaps 30 centimeters wide. Moving target, the assault gun was repositioning for another shot at the farmhouse. Wind, slight crosswind. Visibility, poor due to smoke and dust. It was a shot that no reasonable person would attempt. The odds of hitting were effectively zero. The odds of accomplishing anything useful, even if it did hit, were even lower. Dubois squeezed the trigger. The 7.5mm bullet left the MAS-36 rifle at approximately 850 meters per second. It traveled the 350 meters to the assault gun in less than half a second, a projectile weighing 9 grams carrying kinetic energy that would be dissipated in whatever it struck. What happened in the next instant would be reconstructed later from German survivor accounts, French observation, and physical evidence examined after the battle. The bullet missed the assault gun commander by centimeters, close enough that he likely felt the pressure wave as it passed. It entered the vehicle through the open cupola, traveling at a slightly downward angle. Inside the cramped crew compartment, the gunner was preparing for another shot, his eye to the sight, his hand on the firing mechanism. The bullet struck him in the upper shoulder. Not an immediately fatal wound, but painful and shocking enough to cause an involuntary muscle spasm. His hand jerked on the firing controls. The assault gun's 75mm gun fired, not at the farmhouse as intended, but at a sharp downward angle, the muzzle having been depressed in the seconds before the gunner was hit. The shell impacted the ground directly in front of the assault gun, perhaps 5 meters from the vehicle's front. The explosion created a crater, throwing earth and frozen soil into the air. More critically, fragments of the shell casing and shrapnel ricocheted unpredictably in the confined space between ground and vehicle. One fragment, nobody could say exactly which piece from which part of the shell, struck the track assembly of the assault gun, breaking a link. The track separated, immobilizing the vehicle. Simultaneously, the shock of the premature detonation damaged the gun's recoil mechanism. It wasn't destroyed, but it was rendered inoperable without repair. In the span of perhaps 3 seconds, a single rifle bullet had entered a vehicle through a tiny opening, struck a crew member, causing him to accidentally discharge the main gun, which in turn had immobilized the vehicle and disabled its primary weapon system. The other assault gun and the Panzer IV, seeing their companion vehicle suddenly immobilized, their advance taking unexpected casualties from accurate rifle fire, their infantry scattered and pinned down, did what sensible commanders would do. They halted to assess the situation, and in that halt, momentum died. Chapter 5. The collapse of the advanced military professionals understand that momentum is everything in an assault. Once an advance stops, it becomes exponentially harder to restart. Soldiers who were moving forward with adrenaline and determination become soldiers taking cover, thinking about survival, losing the offensive spirit. The German advance had stopped. From his position in the ruined farmhouse, Dubois watched through his rifle scope as the German force seemed to freeze. Infantry who'd been advancing were now prone, seeking cover. The armored vehicles had halted, their commanders presumably reporting to higher authority, asking for instructions, explaining that the assault had encountered unexpected resistance. "What happened?" Fontaine asked, bewildered. "Did you hit something?" "I'm not sure," Dubois admitted honestly. "I fired at the assault gun. Something happened, but I don't know what." What he did know was that the German advance had stalled, and every minute it remained stalled gave the French defenders more time to prepare, more artillery to be positioned, more opportunities for the precarious defensive line to solidify. Captain Moreau's voice crackled on the radio. "Outpost 1, situation report. The German advance appears to have stopped. What are you seeing?" "Leopard base. Enemy forces stationary. One armored vehicle appears immobilized. Infantry has taken cover and is not advancing. I believe they're reorganizing. Outstanding work. Can you maintain your position?" Dubois assessed the ruins around him. The farmhouse was barely standing. Another direct hit from armor would likely collapse what remained and bury them in rubble. But the Germans seemed hesitant to advance now, uncertain about what they faced. "We can hold for now, sir. Reinforcements are moving to strengthen our line. If you can keep them pinned for another 30 minutes, we'll be in much better shape to receive them. But Jacques, use your judgment. If you need to withdraw, do it." "Understood." For the next 20 minutes, Dubois and Fontaine maintained their position. The Germans made several attempts to resume the advance, but each time, Dubois' rifle cracked, another soldier fell, and the advance faltered. He wasn't shooting rapidly, he had to conserve ammunition, but each shot was precise, targeted, disruptive, and something had changed in the German commander's assessment of the situation. What should have been a straightforward assault against a weak section of line had become complicated. An unknown number of defenders in that farmhouse, they couldn't know it was just 2 men, were inflicting casualties and had somehow disabled an assault gun. Proceeding without neutralizing that position seemed risky, but neutralizing it was proving difficult. At 0745 hours, the Germans made their final attempt. Artillery, they'd apparently called for fire support, began falling on the farmhouse. Not a long bombardment. They didn't have unlimited ammunition either, but enough to reduce what remained of the structure to barely recognizable rubble. "Time to go," Dubois said calmly, grabbing the radio and his rifle. He and Fontaine moved through the collapsed sections of the building, using the rubble itself as cover, crawling and running in alternating bursts, heading toward the French main line 800 meters behind them. German machine guns opened fire, trying to cut them down during their withdrawal. Bullets kicked up frozen earth around them. Fontaine was hit in the leg, not badly, but enough to make him stumble. Dubois grabbed him, half carrying the younger man, moving with surprising speed for someone who'd always been described as mild-mannered and bookish. They reached a shell crater 300 meters from the farmhouse and dove in, catching their breath. From there, French covering fire kept the Germans from pursuing too aggressively, and they were able to move back to friendly lines in stages, using terrain and covering fire. When they finally tumbled into the French trench line, filthy, exhausted, and shaking from adrenaline, they were met by Captain Moreau and several other officers who'd been watching the engagement. "Jacques," Moreau said, his voice full of an emotion he couldn't quite name, "what did you do out there?" "My job, sir," Dubois replied, still methodical even in exhaustion. "Observed, reported, delayed the enemy advance as ordered." "You did more than delay. The German attack has been called off. They're withdrawing. Whatever you did, whatever that shot was that disabled the assault gun, it broke their momentum completely. They've decided this sector is too strongly defended to justify the casualties." Dubois adjusted his glasses. Somehow they'd survived intact despite everything, and smiled slightly. "It was a lucky shot, sir. Nothing more. But it wasn't just luck, and everyone who'd witnessed it knew it. The odds of what had occurred were astronomical. A single rifle bullet, fired under nearly impossible conditions, entering a narrow opening in an armored vehicle, causing a chain reaction that immobilized the vehicle and broke the momentum of an entire attack. Chapter 6. Investigation and Analysis. In the days following the engagement, the sector quieted as both sides reassessed. The German offensive had stalled completely, not just in Moreau's sector, but across the entire front. The Wehrmacht simply didn't have the resources to sustain major operations anymore, and every setback accelerated the collapse. French intelligence officers interviewed Dubois extensively, trying to understand exactly what had happened. They examined his rifle, checked the ammunition, reviewed every shot he'd taken. They wanted to know if there was a technique that could be replicated, taught, turned into doctrine, but there was nothing reproducible. It was shooting skill combined with tactical awareness combined with remarkable, perhaps impossible luck. A week after the engagement, French forces retook the area where the German assault gun had been abandoned. Military engineers examined the vehicle, trying to understand the sequence of events that had disabled it. Their report, declassified in 1975, concluded, the vehicle's immobilization resulted from a complex chain of events initiated by small arms fire. A rifle bullet entered the crew compartment through the commander's cupola, striking the gunner and causing inadvertent discharge of the main weapon. The resulting explosion damaged the track assembly and recoil mechanism. While each individual element of this sequence is technically possible, the probability of all occurring from a single rifle shot is vanishingly small. This appears to be an extraordinary case where multiple improbable events aligned. In simpler terms, it should have been impossible, but it happened anyway. Stories of the impossible shot spread through the French forces, then to Allied units, eventually reaching even German troops through the informal grapevine that existed between enemies. Each retelling embellished the details slightly. The range became longer, the target smaller, the conditions worse. But the core fact remained. Corporal Jacques Dubois had fired a single rifle shot that had somehow stopped an entire German advance. Dubois himself remained characteristically modest about the engagement. When other soldiers asked him about it, he'd shrug and say, "I aimed carefully and fired. The bullet went where I pointed the rifle. What happened after that, I couldn't have predicted or planned." But others recognized something more. General de Lattre de Tassigny, commander of the French First Army, personally awarded Dubois the Médaille Militaire, one of France's highest military honors, in a ceremony held in February 1945. "Corporal Dubois represents everything we admire in soldiers," the general said during the ceremony. "Not the flashy heroics of propaganda, but quiet competence, courage under fire, and dedication to duty. He was ordered to hold a position and delay the enemy. He did so with skill and determination that resulted in the failure of an enemy attack. France is grateful for his service." Dubois stood at attention during the ceremony, his glasses reflecting the weak winter sunlight, looking more like a schoolteacher than a warrior. But he wore the medal proudly, understanding that it represented not just his action, but the efforts of all the men who'd held that desperate defensive line in January 1945. Chapter 7. The final months. The war in Europe had less than 4 months remaining. The German forces in Alsace withdrew gradually, fighting delaying actions, but never again attempting a major offensive in that sector. The failure of the January attacks, including the engagement at the ruined farmhouse, had demonstrated that even weakened Allied lines could hold against Wehrmacht assaults. Dubois continued serving with his unit through the final campaigns. In March, French forces crossed the Rhine. In April, they advanced into southern Germany. And on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. Dubois survived. After 5 years of combat through North Africa, Italy, and France, he made it home. Many of his comrades didn't. Nearly half the men he'd served with in 1940 were dead by war's end. But he survived, carrying physical scars, psychological burdens, and memories of that morning in January when a single shot had changed everything. He returned to Lyon and his job at the post office. His colleagues knew he'd been in the war, knew he'd been decorated, but Dubois rarely discussed his experiences. He'd seen too much, done things that couldn't be easily explained to people who hadn't been there. He preferred to focus on the present, on the mundane tasks of sorting letters and maintaining records, finding peace in the ordinary after years of extraordinary violence. But among veterans, especially those who'd served in the Alsace campaign, the story of Dubois' impossible shot remained legendary. It was told in veterans' halls, published in regimental histories, mentioned in military studies of the campaign. In 1963, a French military historian, Colonel André Mercier, interviewed Dubois for a comprehensive study of French operations in 1945. The interview, preserved in French military archives, provides Dubois' most detailed account of the engagement. "People want to make it more than it was," Dubois said. They want it to be heroic, dramatic, proof of French military prowess. But the truth is simpler and more complicated. I was a soldier in a desperate situation trying to accomplish a mission with limited resources. I saw a target and took a shot that had a very low probability of success. But sometimes low probability doesn't mean impossible. The bullet went where I aimed it. What happened after that was a cascade of consequences that I couldn't have predicted. Was it skill? Partially. I'm a good shot. I won't pretend false modesty about that. Years of practice, thousands of rounds fired, gave me the capability to hit a small target at that range. Was it luck? Absolutely. The bullet had to enter that tiny opening, had to strike the gunner at exactly the right angle to cause him to fire accidentally. The discharge had to occur at exactly the right moment and angle to damage the vehicle. Any one of those factors changes, and nothing significant happens. What I learned from that experience is that warfare, despite all our doctrine, planning, and training, often comes down to moments of chaos where small actions have disproportionate consequences. A single shot stops an attack. A minor mechanical failure changes the outcome of a battle. An individual decision by a junior soldier affects strategic outcomes. That doesn't make war random or meaningless. It makes it human. Unpredictable because humans are unpredictable. Decisive because individuals matter even in the mass violence of modern warfare. I'm proud of what I did that day. I completed my mission, supported my comrades, helped hold the line. Whether the shot itself was impossible or just improbable doesn't really matter. What matters is that I tried, and through skill or luck or divine intervention, people can decide for themselves. It worked. Chapter 8. Legacy and Legend. Jacques Dubois died in 1984 at the age of 73. His obituary in the Lyon newspaper mentioned his military service, his decoration, and described him as a quiet hero who preferred peace to glory. He was buried with military honors, his médaille militaire displayed on his coffin, fellow veterans standing in attendance despite their advanced age. The story of the impossible shot, however, lived on. In French military academies, it's sometimes taught as an example of how individual initiative and marksmanship can affect larger outcomes. The specific circumstances are analyzed, not to suggest that such shots are reliably reproducible, but to emphasize that in chaotic situations, well-trained individuals can create opportunities that doctrine doesn't anticipate. In discussions of probability in combat, military theorists reference the engagement as an example of how low-probability events do occur, and how forces must be prepared to exploit them when they do. Just because something is unlikely doesn't mean it's impossible, and dismissing unlikely possibilities can lead to vulnerabilities. Among soldiers, particularly marksmen and snipers, the story has taken on almost mythical qualities. It's told during training, shared among units, invoked as inspiration. The details have evolved over decades of retelling. Some versions claim the range was over a kilometer. Others add elements of dramatic last stands or heroic sacrifices. But the core story remains. One skilled soldier, one carefully aimed shot, and consequences far beyond what anyone could have predicted. In Riedveer, the village that the French were defending that January morning, there's a small memorial erected in 1995 on the 50th anniversary of the engagement. It doesn't specifically mention Dubois or the farmhouse engagement. There were many actions in the area during those final months of the war, but local historians know the connection. The memorial includes the names of French soldiers who fought in the region, and Dubois' name is there, carved in stone along with his comrades. The ruined farmhouse itself no longer exists. It was cleared away after the war, the land restored to agricultural use. If you visit the area today, you'd see peaceful fields. No indication that this was once a battlefield where a single shot changed the course of an engagement. But veterans who served in the sector and their descendants who've heard the stories can point to the spot where the farmhouse once stood. They can describe the geometry of the engagement, the German approach route, the French defensive line, the 800 meters of open ground that Dubois and Fontaine had to cross during their withdrawal. And they can debate, as people have debated for 8 decades, whether what happened that morning was incredible skill, impossible luck, or something that defies easy categorization. Epilogue. Understanding the impossible. The story of Jacques Dubois and his impossible shot raises questions that extend beyond military history. It challenges our understanding of probability, skill, and the nature of decisive moments. From a purely statistical perspective, what occurred should have been impossible. The probability of a rifle bullet, fired under combat conditions, entering a small opening in an armored vehicle, striking a crew member in such a way as to cause accidental discharge, which then creates a chain reaction that disables the vehicle. Calculating those odds produces numbers so small, they're effectively zero. But effectively zero is not actually zero. Improbable events do occur. They occur rarely, which is why they're improbable, but given enough opportunities, even very unlikely events eventually happen. Dubois fired thousands of shots during his 5 years of combat. He was involved in hundreds of engagements. That particular shot at that particular moment against that particular target succeeded in a way that thousands of other shots hadn't. Was that luck? Or was it the inevitable result of a skilled shooter eventually encountering the perfect confluence of circumstances? Military historians have different interpretations. Some emphasize the skill component. Dubois was an exceptional marksman who created an opportunity where others wouldn't have even attempted a shot. His training, experience, and natural ability made an improbable event possible, even if not probable. Others focus on chaos theory. In complex systems like warfare, small inputs can have disproportionate outputs. The specific outcome couldn't have been predicted, but the general principle, that a single accurate shot can create cascading effects, is sound. Still others simply call it luck, a one-in-a-million combination of factors that happened to align at that moment. No amount of skill or planning could have reliably produced that result. It was simply chance. The truth probably combines all three perspectives. Dubois' skill created the possibility. Chaos and complexity allowed for disproportionate effects, and luck determined that this particular shot, among thousands, would be the one that achieved something extraordinary. What we can say with certainty is that the engagement happened. The German advance did stop. An assault gun was disabled under circumstances that engineers later confirmed were initiated by small arms fire. And Corporal Jacques Dubois was there, rifle in hand when it occurred. Whether we call it impossible, improbable, or simply remarkable doesn't change the fundamental reality. Sometimes in warfare, as in life, single moments define outcomes in ways that seem beyond explanation. And sometimes a quiet postal clerk with good aim and steady nerves becomes a legend for doing exactly what he was trained to do, aiming carefully and pulling the trigger at the right moment. That's not supernatural. It's not even particularly mysterious. It's just the nature of skill, probability, and human effort intersecting in complex ways that produce unexpected results. The shot stopped a German advance. It saved lives, French soldiers who didn't have to face that assault, German soldiers who weren't killed in an engagement that ultimately didn't occur. It became a story that inspired soldiers for generations, a reminder that individuals matter, that skill and courage can make a difference, that even in the mechanized mass violence of modern warfare, there's still room for the personal, the individual, the human. That's the real legacy of Jacques Dubois and his impossible shot, not the technical details of ballistics and probability, but the human truth underneath, that in moments of crisis, ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things, even if those things seem, by all reasonable calculation, impossible. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of World War II's most unusual and debated engagements. The story of Jacques Dubois and the single shot that stopped a German advance reminds us that history is full of moments that seem too unlikely to be true, yet happened nonetheless. If this story fascinated you, please like and subscribe for more content exploring the forgotten stories, unusual events, and remarkable individuals of military history. Share this video to help ensure that soldiers like Jacques Dubois, quiet heroes who did extraordinary things without seeking glory, are remembered. What other improbable moments from military history should we investigate? Let us know in the comments. And remember, impossible is just a calculation of probability. Given the right circumstances, the right skills, and perhaps a bit of luck, even the impossible sometimes becomes reality.